Welcome, welcome, welcome. Once again, this is a reminder, we are recording this session. Please keep yourself muted unless you are asked to turn on your mics if you are a speaker, and then in the Q&A. Oh my God, I see more people coming in. Excellent, welcome. My name is Eli Saltzman. I'm an associate research professor of Israel Studies and the director of the Gildenhorn Institute for Israel Studies. I'd like to express my deepest gratitude to Avis Koyman and Srusti Suresh for all the work behind the scenes that make this event and all other events possible. I want to thank you all for joining us today for a special, very special online event titled Narratives in Conflict, celebrating the work of Paul Scham. What a wonderful, wonderful title. Featuring not only our esteemed and beloved colleague, Professor Paul Scham, but also a number of other fantastic speakers whom I'll introduce in a second. I would like to mention that our next online event titled Strategic Crossroads, China-Israel Engagement in a Shifting Middle East, featuring Michal Zelcher-Lavid, will take place on Monday, April 28th at 12:30 p.m. For more information and to register, please visit www.israelstudies.umd.edu. And now for our main event. Since the Oslo process of the 1990s, scholars have been analyzing and comparing the historical narratives of both sides of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, or Israeli-Palestinian conflict, as well as their divergent internal narratives to better understand the conflict's roots and motivations. Our colleague and wonderful friend, Paul Scham, was one of the first to organize a conference on the subject when he was at the Truman Institute at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem in the 1990s. And he has frequently returned to the subject throughout his career. Professor Scham is retiring this year, and the Gildenhorn Institute is honored to hold this event in recognition of his work at the University of Maryland for nearly 20 years. Before I introduce the speakers, and I know that it's just him and me on this call, I'd like to take a few seconds and say that I'm extremely grateful for Paul, for everything that he has done for us, for me personally. His generosity and kindness knows no limit. Our conversations were always something I was looking for, always stimulating and thought-provoking. We discussed Israeli politics, regional affairs, security, democracy, demography, and anything under the Middle Eastern sun. I consider you a fantastic colleague, Paul, but perhaps more importantly, a true friend. And now it gives me great pleasure to introduce the speakers in order of their appearance today. Professor Eddie Kaufman has worked on conflict resolution and joint research project at UMD, the Hebrew University, and many other institutions, and was a longtime executive director of the Truman Institute at the Hebrew University. Professor Moshe Naoz is a noted scholar of the Ottoman Empire and modern Syria at the Hebrew University, and was twice the director of the Truman Institute. You can see the silver lining there. Professor Yoram Perry has written important works on the media and civil-military relations. After heading the Herzog Institute at Tel Aviv University, he was the founding director of the Gildenhorn Institute, leaving big shoes when he left back to Israel. Dr. Sandra Scham is the editor of the Journal of Eastern Mediterranean Archaeology and Heritage Studies and teaches in the START graduate program at UMD. She is the author of close to 100 articles and 4 books, including The Archaeology of Persecuted People 2024. The final speaker will be Paul Scham, who has taught at UMD since 2008, including 3 years as the director of the Gildenhorn Institute. He published on Hamas, the Israeli right, and current Israeli politics, besides his work on narratives. And for many years was the co-editor of the Israel Studies Review. He will speak with my colleague, the director of Jewish Studies, Max Grossman. We will open the floor for Q&A after their conversation, so please type your questions in the designated chat box at the bottom of the screen, or raise your hand when it is time if you wish to speak. Each speaker will have about 12 minutes. I will give them a 2-minute warning, and then time's up, and then we'll wrap things up just to make sure that we have enough time to have a decent conversation and allow for the Q&A. First to bat is Eddie Kaufman, who will speak about the importance of Arab-Israeli joint research. Eddie, my friend, please go ahead.
I think I committed myself to the audience to speak about the social responsibility of Israeli and Palestinian academics at times of violent conflict. But I do want to start with some reference to my work together with Paul. And I think that will be an extra time if I can get it. And if not, I'll be short on the other second subject. Yes, I'm very glad we are honoring Paul because much of my academic life has to be recorded together of working with him. When I became the executive director of the Truman Institute, soon afterwards I went to a trip to Washington. And at that time I met Paul. I'm talking about two periods of my life and his life that we worked together. The first one, to put it on an historic context, is before the first Intifada. And the second time I met and we worked together is after the second Intifada. Much of our work had to do with how can we cooperate with Palestinian academics. And we have been through a good period after Oslo, and we have been through a very difficult period since. I'd like to say that in the first period, the Truman Institute, that was, by the way, the only peace research institute in the Middle East when it was founded in 1969. Then, after the first Intifada, there was a flourishing of peace institutes in Israeli universities, and the next door to us, the Al-Quds University, became our best neighbor over compared with other universities. Needless to say that Moshe, who is here, who was my boss at that time and an eternal friend forever, he wrote a book with Sali Nusseibeh, who was the president of Al-Quds University. Who would believe at that time, given the VBS today and so on, that here is the head of the Truman Institute for Peace. And not only that Al-Quds University cooperated with us, but they opened a peace center called the Sartawi Peace Center. And that was the first Palestinian university. And we used to say to visitors and also for fundraising purposes, when we look this wonderful view of the Dead Sea and everything of the West Bank, if we look at the right, we should see Al-Quds University. And if we look at the left, we should see Birzeit University. So we need to work with our neighbors. And Moshe and other directors have been, chair of the Institute have been very, very positively involved. So the post-Oslo period for us and for Paul was, how could I say that, a challenge, but also a happy moment because things were flourishing. Just to give you some figures about a book that, booklets that, or a long article that Paul was responsible for, which was all the research done with Palestinians and Jordanians. I believe that mostly the figures of the research that was done with Palestinian academics was staggering. I mean, it was incredible. I'm now looking into my notes, but from the top of my head, I remember it to be, I'll find it. It's about 195 joint projects, 195 joint projects, more than the entire country, academic country at that time. So he published that in Meria. There was you may remember some of the old folks, that was Barry Rubin had a publication. And here were the figures about Paul's article. 62% of these 195 articles were together with Palestinian academics, 62%. Egyptians, 18%. Jordanians, 12%, and then Morocco and Tunis. 195 of which 62 were with Palestinians. I say that because as much as we can tell incredible stories about the period before the second Intifada, when the second Intifada came, that was a terrible downgrading cooperation because of BDS to start with, but also on the Israeli side, I mean, there was a lot of anger on those of us who were trying to continue to work with Palestinians. Just to give an example about Paul. Paul was going to leave around 2002 for a sabbatical, am I right? To go to the Middle East Institute in Washington, D.C. And when we had the annual meeting with the Board of Governors, our donors mostly, one APAC person in particular, he said he shouldn't go there. He was already scheduled to leave and everything. He wanted to stop Paul out of academic freedom and all that. So because he was going to the Middle East Institute, the change of the pressure was immense. And I myself also decided to leave soon after Paul. Paul left in 2002, and I was tremendously under pressure myself also. With some extra bonus, they convinced me I should leave, and then I spent much more time with Paul in Maryland in 1921. But that's irrelevant to the rest of the time. I want to talk about the subject that has been not only my research, but my passion and my own personal experience, which is working across the divide. I also want to give Moshe Maoz a big hug, because it will not be possible to be able to have such a colleague and freedom, because there were always people trying to stop that. Even at Hebrew U, more than once, I felt under not little pressure. In any case, the issue that was important for us was the social responsibility of academics in times of violent conflict, the Israeli-Palestinian case. And why we decided to go for this subject. When BDS started, and there were pressures even before formally it started, it was clear that many of our colleagues were put under terrible pressure not to work with us. So the few that were still working with us, and I will give the example of what I do also with the University of Maryland. The Israel Studies program, your program, invited Professor Manuel Hassasian and myself, not less than 17 years, to teach every summer together. We call it the Israeli-Palestinian experiment. Professor Hassasian was the rector of Bethlehem University. Same thing like Moshe Maoz were working with Sarin Hussein, but very distinguished people. And they were working with us in spite of BDS at the beginning. Professor Hassasian was the chair of the Palestinian Council of Higher Education. And in spite of the pressures, until a moment where he became ambassador to the UK, then he had to leave, but not immediately. So I said, we had a strong commitment of Palestinian academics for quite a long time. And eventually, the change of government in Israel made it even more difficult to continue. The settlers' activities and so on were only bringing more problems for our cooperation. And as I said, after the Second Intifada, with a terrible mistake done by the Palestinians, in my opinion, things started to deteriorate. So Paul had the wisdom, perhaps, to live at a time where cooperation became very, very difficult. Now, the social responsibility was then to say, what can you do at times of violent conflict? We have a violent conflict now. Oslo is over. We have a violent conflict. What can we do? And we say we need to find commonalities across the divide. What could be a commonality? And then we focus on the commonality. And the commonality we found was academic freedom. Palestinians could be under terrible pressure, surely by Israel, because we were the occupiers, but also by their own internal politics. And they could be under terrible pressure. And we say we can also see in Israel some pressures mounting on the Israeli side too. As a result of that, we got UNESCO and we got many other sources to support the idea. I'd like to put it on the screen with the hope that you can see can you see that more or less, the title? This was the project that lasted 5 years, sponsored by UNESCO, sponsored by a Palestinian NGO called Panorama, Dr. Walid Salem, who co-authored the book also with Paul, by the way. The last 2 minutes will be just to say the following. This idea that we have to, as academics, we have a social responsibility. We have been blessed with a very high level of education ourselves, and we should transmit to our students that we should cooperate with everybody that has the same ethics and the same value. And since we say those who oppose the violation of human rights, those who don't accept the right of self-determination, be it Jews in Israel, be it Palestinians in Palestine, not only that we have the right to work together because of academic freedom, but the obligation to work together because of the situation. With this in mind, we got up to 55 Palestinians who disregarded BDS, and for a while, I left Truman in 2004. And since then, since but now there is some revival, I understand. Moshe perhaps is still around, we can say. But the question of Israeli-Palestinian cooperation is nearly, academic cooperation is nearly dead. The last thing I want to say is, at the University of Maryland, there is a good chance to continue to work on that. And I will be always, after being director of the Center for Conflict Management, I'll be glad to cooperate on that. And thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Eddie. That was very, very insightful. Thank you so much for sharing that information. We are now turning to Moshe Maoz. Please don't forget to unmute yourself, Moshe, who will speak about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the Abraham Accords, and the Palestinian cause post-October 7th, 2023. Moshe Maoz, the floor is yours. Don't forget to unmute yourself. Yeah, unmute yourself, unmute. The little microphone bottom. No, you're still muted. There's a little microphone, audio.
How about this? How about now?
There you
Yes?
go.
Very kind. First of all, I'm Moshe Maoz, Hebrew University, Gildenhorn Institute. I'm still there, although very old, just 90 the other day. And I would like to congratulate Paul and Sandra, my good friends, and of course Eddie and everybody else. And we work together, as Eddie mentioned, with Palestinian scholars, including scholars from Gaza. And can you imagine? Now it's all changed. No more relations, even among scholars. We don't see any relation, let alone Gaza, but also West Bank, Sarino, Seba, and they are very, very adamant to cooperate with us. And of course, most Israelis have changed their position regarding the Palestinian issue. Now, what I'm going to discuss very shortly is a book that I just finished, and it's going to be published by Bloomsbury and Lexington shortly. It's about Israel, the Abraham Accords on the brink, threats, challenges, and opportunities. I hope very much there will be opportunities. As you may recall, the Abraham Accords were signed in September 2020 between Israel, the Emirates, Bahrain, Morocco, and Sudan. And there were, in the first 2 years, some strategic achievements for Israel, economic, political, also cultural. But The main failure of the Abraham Accords is the lack of attention to the Palestinian issue. No, the leaders don't care. They are cynical. They wanted some reward from the United States. United Arab Emirates received or were promised to get F-35 fighters. Bahrain had a big naval base, American naval base. Morocco got a recognition of its sovereignty over Western Sahara. Sudan was promised a big loan. But the populations, the publics, identified with the Palestinian issue. And not only they, vis-a-vis this accords, the Abraham Accord, you had the axis of resistance, Mukawaba, led by Iran. And it's not only Shia partners like Hezbollah and Houthis in Yemen, but also Sunnis, Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and others. And the big blow on the Abraham Accords, on the relations between Israel and Palestine were the, October 7th, 2023, as we all record and remember. And the aim, and this was obviously, it's also in the book, the aim of this campaign, which is a very, very brutal campaign, was to destroy the Abraham Accords and to lift or raise the Palestinian issue to the top agenda of Muslims, Arabs, and the international community. And they succeeded. And this is what happened now to the extent that the International Court of Justice in The Hague accused Israel of committing a genocide in the Gaza Strip. Unfortunately, there were attempts to settle the conflict, including a ceasefire between Israel and the Hamas last November, but Israel breached this. And what is going now is also a very ugly campaign. And so many Palestinians have been killed. And it's not only Gaza, it's also the West Bank by settlers. They are committing pogroms against Palestinians. And the Israeli government doesn't care. And in fact, they are being supported by soldiers. Hezbollah also, as I mentioned earlier, Hezbollah joined the campaign a day after 7th of October, on 8th of October, by launching missiles into Israel. And as you know, probably know, there were very fierce campaigns between the sides. There were also a ceasefire recently, but Israel didn't keep the ceasefire. I mean, I don't recognize Israel any longer. So many Palestinians and Hezbollah, even Syria. There is a new regime by Abu Muhammad al-Julani or Ahmad al-Shara. Let's give him a chance. And instead, Israel occupied part of the Hermon, large part of south of Syria, bombing weapons all over, and threatening Syria not to move. And Israel really justifies, unfortunately, the image that it has in the world, and especially the Middle East, as an aggressive. Now, the solution is a Palestinian state next to Israel. According to the Saudi Arab Peace Initiative of 2002, which was accepted, endorsed by all Arab and Muslim states, 57 in number, except for Iran that abstained. And this is also similar to the Clinton blueprint. And although we had only one prime minister, Ehud Olmert, who was a thief, unfortunately, but he suggested also a plan which was similar to the Arab plan. Most Israeli Jews rejected. Only a few weeks ago, the Knesset, 99% members of Knesset rejected the idea of a Palestinian state. So I don't know, the only way to settle is probably by pressure from the United States. Only Trump can change it. But we cannot trust him because he was the one, remember that he initiated the deal of the century, also in 2020, January, and he speaks about the Palestinian state, but very weak and surrounded by Israeli troops. Biden was much better. Now, Trump gives Israel a free hand to damage the Palestinian Authority and, of course, Gaza. So maybe you have any good suggestions what to do in order to settle this issue. It's a Palestinian issue again and again, and it depends very much on Israel. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Moshe Maoz. And now another Turk, Yoram Peri, who worked closely with Paul here at the university. Yoram, the floor is yours, my friend. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. I remember of a very sharp Israeli speaker. He used to start his talks by saying, before I start talking, I want to say something. So before I start talking, I want to say something. Number one, is wonderful to see so many of the old friends that I haven't seen for such a long time. It's really a pleasure. Second, I hate the new fashion, not so new, of people, men who grow their beard. Now I see few of you and I can't recognize you. Hillel Shankar, Sol Sosnovsky, I cannot recognize you. So I'm lucky that I'm lucky that not all of you did that. Third, I'm so happy that Alma Gildenhorn is with us. Without her, we wouldn't have met at all, neither today nor for the last 15 years or so. And the last point is that I thought that I would look at ChatGPT to see who is Paul Scham. And I did it, and I found a fantastic analysis of his life and academic contribution. And I wanted to read it to you, but it was so long that I realized that if I read that, I will not be able to say what I think about him. So I left it. Here it is. I left it, and I recommend you to look at Paul Scham on ChatGPT. And I'll tell you what, now I start my talk. I am both sad and happy to be here with you today. Sad because our dear friend Paul is retiring from the Institute, but happy because this gives us an opportunity to praise him for the fruitful years at the university, for his contribution to academic research on Israel, and on the excellent education he has provided to hundreds, perhaps even more, students, particularly in helping them understand the complicated Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the path to its resolution. Paul believes that the university should not be an ivory tower. Having this outlook, he helped me build the Gildenhorn Institute in a way that is unique, that is quite different from most other research centers on Israel. We did not see its role as advocacy organization for Israel, opposing its adversaries. Our vision was that the Institute should be a center for genuine academic study and research. But at the same time, it should also be a place that fosters the love of peace, the desire to know the other, a commitment to social justice, and hope for shared living. And Paul truly was engaged academic, as we heard by the first two speakers, a social activist, a seeker of peace and justice. That's how I first met him decades ago when he was doing his interesting research at the Truman Institute, as we heard from Eddie. And that is how he remained, even after I arrived in Maryland, many years following him, and throughout the 13 years we worked together. Paul embodies the compelling combination of academic perspective and worldview with personal character traits. He is a man of peace. I never saw him angry or in conflict with anybody. He listens to everyone, embraces everybody, and makes an effort to understand even those who oppose him on his views. He is a good friend and a very loyal partner. I greatly enjoyed working with him all these years, and together we succeeded in turning the Institute into the largest in the United States in terms of number of courses and students. I had similar pleasure working with him as a co-editors of the Journal of the Association of Israel Studies, Israel Studies Review, making it within very short period of time a leading interdisciplinary journal on Israel. Every time I was busy with my own research in Israel or away from the office, I knew with full confidence that I could rely on him, that the machine would work well, would keep running smoothly. And that's exactly what happened. I want to finish with two more comments. Number one is that I'm very happy that Eli Salzman has taken the reins after me and Paul, and I'm glad to see that he's doing that this excellent way. Second, it is also my wish to commend Professor Maxine Grossman, who has elevated the level of cooperation between the Gildenhorn Institute for Israel Studies and the Center for the Jewish Studies, and does so with talent, grace, and sensitivity that reflect the very character traits Paul embodies. I cannot end without mentioning our wonderful friend Avis. Without her, nothing could have happened in the Institute. So thank you all. If I have one more minute, do I?
Yes,
I will
please.
say something else, and that is that the concept that Paul has developed of narratives is getting a momentum today in Israel. 2 months ago, my friend Alon Liel, Dr. Alon Liel, together with the late Yehuda Litani, published a book called "And We Shall Break Them," V'chitetu chirvoteihem leitim. The book examines how three seemingly intractable conflicts, those in Cyprus, Northern Ireland, and South Africa, were resolved, and contrasted them with the ongoing Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The major lesson of that book is that if to solve these problems, you need a parity of esteem. That is the word that he's using. You need an equal dignity. And in a way, he's talking about the narratives the same way that Paul mentioned. So Paul, you should know that your concepts of narratives is getting at last some echo in Israel. And by saying that, I hope that you don't hear the echo of the airplanes that are now flying over my house, probably in preparations for an attack or threat of attack of Iran. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Yoram. Thank you so much. We now turn to Dr. Sandra Scham, who will talk about violent extremism in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Sandra, go ahead, my friend.
Okay, thank you. Okay, now for something completely different. Unfortunately, I'm not going to talk that much about my history with Paul because I don't have that much time. Needless to say, it goes back quite a few years. But one thing that I am very grateful to him for is the opportunity to end up doing work for peace in Israel. Because of his involvement with Truman, I got very much involved in a lot of activities, including we did the first joint Palestinian-Israeli archaeological project ever, funded by the State Department. With Paul's assistance, I think that we were able to sell that proposal to the State Department, and it went on for about 5 years with some success, but then again, 2 steps forward and 3 steps back. But I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the differences between historical narratives and the kind of narratives I do now. I started out working on historical and archaeological narratives, but ended up working for, as a result of a fellowship, working for USAID on countering violent extremism. Just because I had lived in the Middle East, they decided I was perfect for it. So, but it is indeed a very different idea from historical narratives that we have been talking about. First of all, the study of narratives in CBE and counterterrorism. You want to adjust? Sorry. A CBE and counterterrorism is it's not the same as a study in history, because in history, you're looking to understand how people think about their past, the same in archaeology. But if you're doing CBE work, there's an active component. You have to understand the narrative, and there is an idea that you can counter it. Now, I don't believe in counter narratives, but people working in counterterrorism and countering violent extremism have been trying to do this for years with little effect. I think one has to have a very, very deep understanding of a culture in order to come up with the narrative to counter what extremist narratives are. And they take a very deep dive into culture. They involve ideology, religion, traditions, oral history. All of these things really go into the kind of narratives that that promote people that promote violence. So essentially the difference between extremist narratives, we see historical narratives, structure historical events. Contested narratives, of course, provide differing historical accounts of those events, but extremist narratives are stories. They're very compelling stories. And they reference history, religion, ideology, all of these things, culture, and but they also explain events in a way that promotes intolerance, violence, and othering. In other words, the action component is built into the narrative. It informs action. It doesn't become, it would not be an extremist narrative otherwise. So it just looking at that that definition of extremist narratives, I looked at 2 very different examples from Israel and Palestine. I think it won't be surprising that I was looking at Hamas and the Hilltop Youth as examples of extremists, very different ones. Hamas is organized, has leadership, has a defined leadership usually, and basically is more predictable. The Hilltop Youth are very loosely organized, almost anarchic. They do have leaders, people they look to for spiritual guidance, but in short, they are quite a different kind of terrorist or violent extremist group. I'm losing my voice a little bit. Violent extremist group than we normally think of with respect to the Middle East. Consequently, a lot of people prefer, I think, to think of the Hilltop Youth as a criminal youth gang. And of course, Naftali Bennett is one of those people. He sought to rehabilitate them. His statement about them is quite interesting. He talks about them being at-risk Israeli teens and people who have lost their way. The general kind of language that you use to speak about a youth gang is the way Naftali Bennett saw it, and he looked into efforts to rehabilitate them based on the fact that they were lost boys, if you will, and girls as well. And of course, a lot of educational programs and other programs were instituted in order to try to rehabilitate them. Unfortunately, they weren't successful, and probably because they did start out with the idea that they were gang members. And gang members, of course, we can think about what their goals are, but basically they don't have a strong religious and political ideology, which is an essential difference between Hilltop Youth and gang members. So another effort to rehabilitate them, the IDF actually sought to include them in a group as soldiers policing the West Bank. What could possibly go wrong? But obviously a lot of things went wrong. And in 2023, they had to disband the unit because they were accused of unprovoked attacks on villages, which is essentially what essentially what they did before. I don't know why they would expect that putting them in uniform would actually make them act differently, but it was an attempt to say, oh, well, these people are lost youth, and we need to do this in order to rehabilitate them, give them something positive to work on. Their narrative is actually quite interesting, especially to me as an archaeologist, because it really harkens back to the days of the judges, especially Samson, who was probably among a group of judges in the Bible that are described in the Bible. Samson is probably the worst in terms of being an actual political leader. He was not a leader of any sort, basically known for destroying things and essentially actually being less of a leader and more of a victim in the end. And but the Samson narrative, of course, is actually included in songs and stories that motivate the Hilltop Youth. And it's not that they're looking for a suicidal end to their current predicament, but they see him as someone who knew how to take vengeance, and vengeance is a motivation. It's a strong motivation, and that's built into the narrative that they have adopted. And most recently, Rachel Feldman she edited a volume about narratives of indigeneity in the West Bank, which is quite interesting, and she pointed out that more and more the idea that the people living there are indigenous, they're rooted in the land, regardless of when they actually arrive there, has taken root. And this, combined with the Hilltop Youths hearkening back to the days of the Bible and the days of the early Israelite settlement, has made them quite intransigent. And I believe that this will be a growing problem, and already has achieved a very high level of concern in Israel. I most recently in 2024, Shin Bet leader Ronan Bar called them terrorists in a letter to Netanyahu. Now, of course, he's leaving like imminently, but not the most popular person in the current government. But he had a point. I would call them violent extremists. There's not a great deal of difference between the two. The difference lies in how you counter their extremism. And of course, I would say that still the Hilltop Youth are haven't reached the level of being out and out terrorist. But they've killed several hundred people, but certainly they're lethal. But they're not as lethal as the second group, of course, that I've studied. Oh, okay. Well, I'm not going to go. Everybody is familiar with Hamas and the Hamas charters. And I just wanted to make a point that the way in which I see, again, I don't, I haven't lived in Israel during this time period, but just from the records of and newspaper articles about what's been happening, I see that Israel has approached Hamas as the United States used to approach extremist groups. In other words, we thought if we killed their leader, then they would disband. It certainly didn't work for Al-Qaeda or ISIS, and it's not actually working necessarily for Hamas. But I think a lot of the research that has been done into Hamas has focused on Yahya Sinwar, and at this point, of course, he's no longer there. Essentially, if we look at the Hamas charter, which is the outline of what their narratives are, it's changed over the years. They started out, of course, by saying that we have to kill all the Jews in order to bring the end of days, of course, apocalyptic rhetoric. And then in 2017, Yahya Sinwar, who had been released from Israeli prison along with 1,026 other prisoners in exchange for Thank you. Yeah, Gilad Shalit. Yes, sorry. Anyway, but he oversaw a revision of the charter in which they specifically said removed references to killing Jews and stated that the Hamas fight was not with the Jews or the Jewish religion, specifically saying that, but with Zionism. Again, that still stands as a Hamas Hamas statement, but lately they of course, essentially they abrogated that completely on October 7th. They issued a document later that explained what their view of October 7th was. It was published in 2025, a couple of months ago, and that's when they started to look at these. Look at what Israel was doing and what their narratives were. And it's always interesting. It's an interesting read. I won't go into it in detail. I don't have the time, but it is interesting to see that they are taking apart Israeli narratives and trying to do counter narratives. So this is a development in terms of the development of the organization as a terrorist group. So this is, of course, a very complicated thing. So I'm going to end here, but happy to answer any questions about any of these things, but that's an overview. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Sandra. That was very, very interesting. And now the main event, in a sense, of the main event. Paul Scham and Max Grossman, the floor is yours, my friends. Please go ahead.
Before we start, I really want to thank all of you. I see so many older friends here, people I've worked with here and in Israel and in many contexts. So it's really a heartwarming experience. And thank you all. So I'll be doing this dialogue with Max Grossman. So shoot.
Okay, let's get started. Thank you for including me in this wonderful conversation. I'm grateful to be here, and it's a pleasure to work with you and to see all your friends and colleagues who are so lovely. It's good to be together. One of the words we've been hearing a little bit today, and one of the words that I think about a lot when I think about your work, is narrative, historical narrative. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you first got interested in this concept. What brought you to historical narrative as a concept?
When I was working with Eddie and Moshe in the late 1990s during Oslo, we met with a lot of Palestinians, and it struck me that invariably at that time we could talk about the present and commiserate about the fighting. We could talk about the future when it seemed like we had a future. But we always argued about the past, and it wasn't a fruitful argument. And I was also reading at that time Uri Severe's book about the genesis of Oslo, and he stated their first rule was no history. And I started thinking about why history was so hot. And it seemed to me at that point that once peace was being made, it was necessary to understand more deeply what people thought about their own history. Obviously, the first part never took place, but I think it's still relevant as a way of seeing the other person or the other side, understanding why they're fighting.
I think that makes a lot of sense. And I think at the same time, it's a little challenging, particularly for some people on this call, to say no history. I don't think you mean that you're not talking about the past precisely, but what is it about other people's history that comes into this conversation? About other people's rather than one's own, perhaps?
Well, I'm making a distinction between diplomats who are trying to establish something that would stand in political context, and work of scholars who try to provide the material. You asked what knowing about them would provide. I think most Israelis on some level, or many, have thought the Palestinians just want to destroy us. It's anti-Semitism.
Mhm.
It's envy of our wealth, whatever. I think going back and learning what that the Nakba actually happened, as all Israeli historians know by now and admit in varying degrees, helps to see that there is a reason behind that. It may it also, for some people, I think, provide an excuse. Well, if we did so much to them, how could they ever make peace with us? It's not an exact science, but I think understanding is better than non-comprehension of your enemy or your adversary.
I have to say that I think that sounds both important and also characteristic. As Yoram was saying, the concepts that you've talked about, the desire to know the other, commitment to shared living, I think are important to your work, not only theoretically, but also in very practical ways. Can you talk a little bit about the difference between what you think of as narrative and what you think of history, not merely defining the terms, but also how they change your outlook academically and practically?
I think of a narrative as the story that a people or a society tells about itself. And it can change over time, but the basic outlines usually remain the same. And if you grow up in the society, you know the narrative. You may oppose it, your parents may oppose it, you develop views against it, but you know what it is through newspaper, the internet. I'm dating myself through communication, school, government, everything. You have an idea of what it is. I think of history as what is written by historians in an attempt to get at a coherent and informed and cited source basis for the past, trying to link things that may not have been apparent at the time, and also to bring in the parts that a narrative leaves out because they're inconvenient. People want to show itself in a good sense. A historian may can go all over the map, but if they're doing a conscientious job, I think they have to show some of the warts on their society as well as tell the parts they're proud of.
Well, it sounds to me in a way then that one of the issues with a narrative, as opposed to a history, which we could argue has a sort of variety of methods and a kind of intentionality to it, that narratives are doing social and cultural work in a way that they're the thing you can't get away from that you try to get away from. It reminds me of William Faulkner's observation that the past isn't over, it isn't even really past. To the extent that narratives are things that people are invested in, I wonder, it seems to me that narratives become the thing that can get in the way of the dialogue. So how have you kind of mobilized that tension to turn narratives into something that's meaningful and effective? Have you found it hard to ask people to kind of face their own narratives and the problems of those narratives, or do you feel like you're mobilizing the narratives to get people to feel sort of respect for each other simply because they have those narratives? Not that I'm trying to simplify, but how do narratives help and hinder this process?
Well, I think Eddie could answer that better than I could, because he's or people like Michelle, who's in the audience, because they do much more conflict resolution as such. I do mostly teaching and writing, and I, in my articles, say an encyclopedia of race and racism. I wrote the article on Zionism. I try to show that Zionism, which even 10 years ago, and certainly now, has this emblematic hatred that many people show for it. I think understanding what it was intended to be at different times helps to see to demonize it. I won't claim that it's been demonized at all, but I think you have to come to terms with what it was intended to be for Palestinians to understand that and what its effect has been on Palestinians for Israelis to understand.
It sounds like some of what you're talking about is about allowing yourself to be surprised, allowing yourself to be challenged, maybe even recognizing that other people don't think what you think. How do students manage that? I know you have hot and cold running students to your office hours, so they must be at least engaging with it.
They're engaging as always in very different ways. The students that I feel best about are the few Arab and Muslim students who have actually had the nerve to take a class labeled as Israel Studies. And one of them, though, someone Eddie and probably others know, she a Pakistani American who went on to become president of J Street U. And at a J Street conference, she told me, she told the audience, Professor Scham turned me into a Zionist, which wasn't my intent. But another student who Eddie also knew, he had a grandfather who had fought for Egypt in the 1948 war. And after my class, he insisted on going to Israel for a semester of study with Eddie. His parents were not pleased at all by that, but he went and he did not turn into a Zionist. But he was informed and understood what he was talking about. And a lot of Jewish students who just said, either with a surprise or they had expected it, this is not what I learned in day school. And that's what makes this worthwhile.
On so many levels, on so many levels. I wonder if that could be on our swag in the future. You did bring up something really important that I want to ask, and then I'll let you have your final 2 cents. And that's this idea that that everybody has this capacity for their mind to be changed, but we're not predicting or even desiring that they be changed in particular ways. Is there any argument for a joint narrative? I have heard of such things, but I get the sense that that is not something you're interested in. Can you say more about that?
The joint narrative is a great idea. I believe in understanding and combining when possible. In practice, it usually ends up really as one side's story with a few additions from the other. The other thing it can end up on is trying to include all the important parts from both sides, in which case it's politically correct in a sense, but doesn't tell a story that anyone can recognize. The first one, not surprisingly, Elon Pape put out what he called a joint narrative 20 years ago or so. And that was, as you'd expect, basically the Palestinian narrative with a few additions. I imagine I know of a Palestinian historian who is working on trying to give not a joint narrative, but a understanding of both. And I'm looking forward to that being published in the next year or so.
It does seem that a fundamentally dialogic approach here allows for not only differences in content, differences in tone and interpretation, but also the recognition that these multiple narratives create different understandings, expectations, kind of epistemological realities in some ways. On that note, I would love to know where you are now and where you're going next, because we're going to miss you terribly around here. How has your perspective changed over the last 30 years, and what's happening next? What do you think, and what do we do?
Well,
Eli's like, yeah, great. Give him the heaviest one.
I can't say that things have actually gotten better. Obviously.
That's regrettable.
What?
That's regrettable.
But my own interests have shifted more towards understanding the religious right in Israel and their understanding of the past and how that propels them into the future. Because, as we all know, they have in many ways the upper hand in what's going on now. And to try to understand how they use their conception of the past to for various requirements for Israel, that we see be carrying out currently, seemingly with great enthusiasm. I think in some ways it's more important for the people on this course, on this call, to understand where they're coming from and where they're going because of their current power. And I'm not sure where the Palestinian narrative can express itself in the current situation.
I think that is a difficult but important insight, and possibly a good point for us to take as a pause as we hand the floor back to Eli. I'm sure there are people with questions and comments. Thank you very much, Paul.
Thank you very much, Max. Again, thanks to all of you. And I'm looking forward to questions for me and the other speakers as well. Take it, Eli.
Thank you so much, Paul and Max. That was wonderful in so many ways. And I have a bunch of questions, as I always do. I'm just going to take advantage of my kind of role as the moderator here. And first of all, try to encourage you to write.
Can you speak louder?
Oh, yes. Yeah. Absolutely. Thank you so much, folks. I'll take advantage of my role as mediator and just remind you to type your questions either in the chat box or in the Q&A. Somebody alerted me to the fact that it's not visible necessarily. You need to hover over with your mouse or your cursor. But we are open to that. You can also raise your hand. You can find that under reactions or react at the bottom of your screen. Click on the heart, and then you can raise your hand. Just a reminder that a question is a sentence with a question mark at the end. Obviously, it's a very friendly and social environment. You can make a couple of comments, certainly, but we are more than welcoming your questions at the same time. I'd like to ask a question, Paul. You talked about narratives, and there's a wonderful book series that kind of tries to explain everything and anything in the world. Something for dummies, right? The stock market for dummies. So the Israeli-Palestinian conflict for dummies, so to speak, version. What would be the one thing that we all need to know in order to understand where it's coming from and perhaps where it's going to? But just the one thing, just the X, one variable, one factor, so to speak. Is there one?
I think the most important one is that the conflict will not end until there is some significant and acceptable form of Palestinian self-determination. And unfortunately, I don't think most Israelis will accept that now, even if they might have 25 years ago. But however, the history of the last century and a half shows the Palestinians becoming a people, and it's not just a right to self-determination. I don't think they'll let Israel go without having achieved that. So that's what I'd say, and perhaps I'll be barred next time I try to go to Israel.
Or you'll be deported.
Try to return to the U.S. This is also a kind of becoming an issue. Just saying. Philip Matal raised his hand. Philip, my friend. or Paul's friend, actually. Please go ahead. The floor is yours. Just don't forget to unmute your. Yep, I think you need to unmute.
And what
There
about
you
now? Okay, great. This is a wonderful opportunity to see old friends, especially Eddie.
Can you speak up?
Should I raise my, let's see.
Try to raise your voice. Speak
Okay.
loudly with gravitas. And
All right.
there you go.
So it's a wonderful opportunity to see old friends, especially Eddie and Moshe. Moshe was here some time ago, and we used to get together and discuss the Arab-Israel conflict over a bottle of single malt liquor. I want to take the opportunity also to say something about my friend Paul. I feel lucky that he is in Washington, D.C., where we get together and catch up on personal matters, but also, well, usually on Israeli-Palestinian issues. I consider Paul as one of the most astute, imaginative, objective analysts of the Arab-Israel conflict. He's able to transcend his background, commitments, and sympathies, and empathize with both sides, what E.H. Carr calls imaginative understanding, which we need more of, especially these days when people are angry and ideological. That is why I hope that he has more time to write after retiring, so that he can reach a wider audience that would benefit from his prudent analysis and advice. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Philip. That was very, very, very kind of you and very generous. We have one question from the audience. I'm going to read it, and then we have two. Oh, I see that. Okay, so Ethan, you go first, my friend. Ethan McMahon will ask his question. Go ahead, please.
Sure. Thank you very much. This has been very enlightening for me. I appreciate everyone who's working towards peace, not towards conflict. But my question is very simple, but deep. How can we promote this critical thinking even as the world has moved on towards short messages on social media, which allows short messages and even lies to be able to be propagated so fast?
Paul, you're muted. Hold on. You're muted. Hold on. Hold on. Almost there. There you go. Please go ahead.
Who would you like to answer the question?
Maybe you. It seemed like your talk was this way, but just to have a shorter answer.
You are it today. Yes.
For more people to ask and answer questions, though.
I am not on Twitter. I
X.
On X, and I really don't know. I wouldn't say I have an answer for it. I know I'm old-fashioned. I write articles for periodicals. They are a bit more than 180 characters. So I'm not the one to answer that, but it's an essential question. Perhaps Yoram, who does communication, would be a better candidate to answer that.
Hold on. Yoram, you're muted. Don't forget to unmute. There you go.
Just one sentence, not more than that. The role of the social media is already well known. as a very negative, it has a very negative impact on the new modern or postmodern discussions, debates, and it will take some time before it's going to be changed. The Australians and some European countries have begun to work on that, but it will take a long time before it happens. In the United States, it even worsened because of the impact of Trump and the collusion between Trump and the extremely rich leaders of that technology. But if I have a minute, I would like to tell the story that Paul, you spoke about our student. And you mentioned that she studied with Eddie. I don't think that she studied with Eddie. Eddie, tell me if you know that. She studied with me, and it's a fantastic story. She was born in the United States to Pakistani Muslims, and she led the group of the Muslims at the university. After I gave a course on Israeli politics, I realized that I have in my class few leaders of student organizations. So the next year, I said, I'm going to teach only leaders of student organizations. There were 25 students, 15 of them were leaders of student organizations. And she came there as a leader of the Muslim organization. She was fascinated with the topic, and then she began to work with some leaders of Jewish organizations, even with the Zionists of America, which are extreme right-wingers. Then she went to Israel, went to kibbutz, and she came back to the United States, and she said, I have become a Zionist. So she changed her position, and she joined J Street at the university, student J Street. And she became the leader of J Street at the university. From there, she became the J Street of Students National Organization. So she was invited to Obama, to the president, as the leader of a Jewish organization. 6 months later, they didn't change their files at the White House. So she was invited once again, this time as a leader of a Muslim organization. So that woman went twice to Obama, once as a Muslim, once as a Jew, as pro-Israel Zionist. And later on, she continued to work. She went to the South to work with the unprivileged people, and I'm sure that we'll hear about her very much in the future. A wonderful story. I think that's the best story of our success in the Gildenhorn Institute.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Yoram. We have Hillel, we have Eddie Kaufman, and then Yael W. Next. Hillel, go ahead, my friend. Don't forget to unmute yourself, please.
Well, first of all, it's wonderful to see so many involved and active people celebrating Paul's experience and academic activities. What the comment I wanted to make was that I am the Israeli co-editor together with Ziad Abu Ziad of the Palestine Israel Journal, and we have 15 Israeli and 15 Palestinian members of the editorial board, including Eddie Kaufman and Moshe Maoz. And when we added Dr. Tony Klug, who was based in London, as the first non-Israeli and non-Palestinian member of the editorial board, Paul wrote to us and said, why don't we also have someone based in the United States? And I would very much like to be that person. We very much welcomed him to be a part of the editorial board. And whenever we have Zoom editorial board meetings, he is very actively involved and makes important contributions, as I would call it, an insider-outsider, both as an Israeli, as an American. I'd just like to make one comment to Yoram Perry. I've had this beard since I was 18, and the only thing is that the color changed.
Thank you so much, Hillel. We have Eddie Kaufman and then the LW, as I said. Don't forget to unmute yourself, my friends.
Yes, I do. Actually, this last comment of Hillel is very important because I just published together with a former Palestinian student from Ramallah. I was teaching at Haifa, and she was working before at the Mokata, where the Palestinian Authority residence is. And we just published in the last issue of Palestine Israel Journal. And she, Suhir, became also a board member for the Palestine Israel Journal, which is to say, like in the last line of our national anthem, Atikva, Od lo avda tikvateinu. In spite of all what I'm telling you about the question of boycott, I want to add to the story that Mubarak Awad, who used to teach at AU, who has been the founder of Nonviolence International, and then, he's a Palestinian who lived in Washington, D.C. most of his life because he was expelled from Israel by Yitzhak Shamir. And just to make the story short, Mubarak Awad said, boycott, I agree in our statements, as I say, this group that was formed of Palestinians and Israelis, boycott, sanctions are a legitimate, non-violent way of action. I do agree to that. I boycott the produce of the settlers. I just want to be on record on that. I'm not ashamed of that. I'm a Zionist and a patriot because we cannot do, anyway, the point I want to make about that is that the Palestinians that are reflecting about working with Israelis need to be sure that we do accept nonviolent opposition. As at the first Intifada, mostly it was not violent. So I wanted to clarify this point. A comment to Paul, because we have talked more than once about that. The question of memory, the question of history could be an obstacle, as we now can see it so clearly. But I can tell you, from what I have read from other people, after 3 generations, there is a good chance that memory becomes history. Well, take the Inquisition and our relation with Spain. Take Germany and France, 3 bloody wars over a century. And now they're the best friends. France and Germany happen to be the best friends in Europe. So I say, I want to translate it. I don't want to lose my hope. However, we need to do the merit. It's not happening again. And what happened after the war was that everybody helped Germany to rebuild. And we are not in Israel doing our job. This is the only difference. But it's not that history is such a deterministic phase that we cannot overcome. 3 wars, including, and look at Israel and Germany. Do I have to tell you something about that? How can we overcome? On one last little thing I wanted to say. When I left College Park after 21 years, I think I was also teaching there one way or another. We spoke with Paul about bringing to the Israel Studies Center, and surely with Yoram as well many times, something that we call the Bridging Fellows, postdoctoral Arab and Jewish students from Israel at the beginning. Who knows later on? But we have in Haifa a problem now that Arabs from Israel are boycotted also by BDS. I share my office at Haifa University with Hassan Ghanem, a very radical Israeli Palestinian. And nevertheless, they are not allowing him to do activities with the Palestinians from the West Bank, occupied West Bank. So all I'm saying is, let's have the Israeli Studies Center be Israeli. There is no one Arab here in the conference. I regret that because they should be. And I am very keen to help to fundraise. It's very dear to me, the University of Maryland. And I will be very happy, I'm sure Yoram too, that has been spending time helping with the New Israel Fund, with fellowships for Arabs and Jews. And they have a program at AU, by the way, of course, an MA program for Israeli Arab and Israeli Jews. So I think it's high time that the Israel Studies program should get funding. And I'm willing to help. I'm sure Yoram too. I see. And to try to get funding for, if possible, for 3 years, 5 years, to bring postdoctoral students, that one Israeli Jew and one Israeli Palestinian.
Thank you so much, Eddie and Yoram, for committing to gift the Israel Studies program towards this postdoc. Our gift officer will reach out immediately afterwards. Yael W. is next. Go ahead, my friend.
Eddie, by the way, I think is the only Israeli Jew who had a hunger strike for a Palestinian activist.
Yeah.
All righty. Thank you so much, folks, for the comments. Yael, go ahead, please.
I just mention it briefly. I don't want to put them on the spot, but my friend Philip Matar is an Arab American who is here. But you're right, we should have far more. Sorry.
Thank you so much. Yael W., this is your turn.
Thank you. So I want to say a tribute to Paul and then end it with a question as you instructed. Paul, I've known you nearly 30 years now. I can't believe I'm that old. I want to say thank you for all your mentorship over the years, and most importantly, for being you. And I want you to know, whenever your name comes up to colleagues of my generation who unfortunately have otherwise experienced academia as often being cold, they will always say you are the nicest person they have ever met, as differs, and I'm serious, from so many others. You shouldn't laugh. They've come into contact. So on behalf of so many people from my generation, I want to thank you. On a larger note, and I hope Sandra's there, as you, Sandra, Eddie, Moshe will remember, I worked at the Truman Institute during the 1990s heyday period that Eddie described. I was there as a Stanford University, UC Berkeley, John Gardner Fellow for Public Service. I was fortunate to be given Nomi Chazan's office, and I got to look out over the gorgeous view Eddie described. And I really, reflecting, listening today, I realize how much that period so heavily influenced me, and specifically because of you, Paul, through your applied scholarship and approach, but fundamentally your kindness, which I think is so evident by all the people who've come here today to celebrate you. And I want to just, give a few quick examples. So it was at Truman that I met Sandra, and at the time, baby Annette, who herself is nearly 30 now. I want to say that because of, the research, the work, your applied approach, Paul, to this day, my applied research in the field of communication is heavily focused on narratives. As you know, I focus on all the ethnopolitical narratives of those party to conflict. So in this case, 3 narratives. I still work that way. Paul took me to my first meeting at the Knesset. It was a backdoor meeting where the only other woman there was the secretary, and I kept being mistaken for the secretary. And Paul was very kind and made a point to say exactly that they're getting confused. He was very nice, made sure I felt welcome, which otherwise, was not such a welcome moment when you keep getting mistaken for the secretary as an academic. I also want to say that Paul, via Sandra, introduced me to ACOR, now the American Center for Research in Amman. This was March 1998. And because of you, I want you to know, I later learned about PARC. Phil Matar, I was later a PARC fellow. I, until last year, was vice president of the American Institute for Maghreb Studies. Paul, Sandra, if you had not introduced me and told me where to go in Amman when I was at the Truman Institute, I don't think any of that would ever happen. I also want to say that everything Eddie talked about, it's not strange to me to collaborate or still be in touch with Palestinian colleagues. Sam Bahul, who is here celebrating you, I had brought him in touch with the Truman Institute. We're still in touch. He's still in touch with you. All of those, this is a bit more Eddie, that we collaborated with Palestinians from the Gaza Community Mental Health Program. You should all know that the next generation, my research assistants were all from there. We are the next generation. And I'm still in touch with colleagues who are from there, who work from there. You all should know that continues. And that even last year, I was in India and gave a talk you'll all remember from the same period, Kumar Swami Nathan, who we all know is Kumar, who runs the West Asia Center. I went to JNU last year, and that's all from that period. Still in touch, with all of these people. So you should know that, right? What was fostered at the Truman, but particularly, Paul, your kindness. And as I promised, there'll be a question here at the end, rather than an academic question or seemingly academic, because I really think your greatest gift has been your kindness, and I don't want to understate that for my generation. As Phil said, what will you do now? I want to add to that. What will you do to be kind to yourself? I'm serious. And thank you for this time.
That is a beautiful question, Paul. I think everybody's eager to learn what you have in mind.
Well, I'm not sure if this is kindness or not, but my current thought is to, as I mentioned in the letter most of you got, is to try to do a Substack or write a Substack, which I'm mentioning because now that I've said it all to you, I'll have to do it. I can't duck out of it. So I'm not sure. I'll have to get back to you, Yael, and thank you very much for the question and all the nice things you and others have said that I hope Sandra is taking on board, about someone who never gets angry. So
Okay.
Well, I guess you learn something new every day. Alrighty, folks. Thank you so much for coming today, for sharing this wonderful, wonderful, bittersweet moment, as Yoram Peri rightfully observed earlier. Paul is a great person. He's still around. He's not going anywhere. We still have him, and we will have him until eternity and plus and beyond. And so it is truly, truly, truly an honor and a pleasure to have him as a colleague just upstairs and down here, having these conversations all the time. Thank you so much to the audience for attending. For all the comments in the chat box, I will share those with Paul, because he will be flattered, he will be flustered, he will be floored, and so many other words with F at the beginning. But in any case, I look forward to seeing you in our events in the future, and I look forward to seeing Paul tomorrow on campus.
And I will keep in touch with you. Please keep in touch with me. Thank you again.
Thank you so much, folks. Rak besorot tovot, only good news, hopefully, inshallah. Eid Mubarak. Take care, folks. Chag Sameach. Happy Passover. See you around.